Well, I want to give a talk that goes over some of the, research and observations and writing down of things. One of the things I've been looking at over the past year or so, which is fantastically highly related to the talk you just saw, as if it were somehow planned out to be that way, which as far as I know is not the case. But maybe someone else has conspired for that delightful coincidence. It's essentially the idea, more general, of what you were just hearing about, of what it means and why you would put something like a platform in place. That is, a centralized chunk of infrastructure that tries to make as, let's say, efficient to run and use, but also sort of a set of features that evolves that your developers, people writing your own software, use to actually not only like run their software in production, but also be part of defines what that software looks like and how it all fits together. If you're familiar, I don't know if you can tell, I don't use that much hair dye at all, but I'm a little older. If you remember back in the days, there was this thing in the Java world called an application server. And then there's whatever a lamp stack was, and on and on and on. And all of those are kind of like the historic precedents of what a platform is, right? That it's very difficult when I talk to my non-technical relatives. I can't really explain what I do at all. So if y'all have any tips, that would be great. Hopefully I can explain what I do to you all. How that platform is run and situated in a company that wants to actually improve the way that they're doing software and kind of get to that ideal state where you can not only run your stuff in production and have it work, which is always that story people forget to put in the backlog, customer would like software to work. It also gets them to the point, these organizations that want to improve how they're doing software, where they can not only release software every week, but maybe even multiple times a day. And I'll speak briefly about, other than being cool, why that's useful for organizations. But what I'm going to go over is kind of, from a high level, kind of what, especially at large organizations, what that strategy of a platform looks like and how organizations are putting it in place and how they're kind of bootstrapping it up in a large organization. So first, a little self-aggrandizing and advertising for myself. I'm always trying to figure out how many logos I can actually put on this slide. Maybe one day I'll go back to just one. But so I'm Coté. My first name is Michael, but I used to work at a startup where there were like 4 or 5 other Michaels. So I was assigned the name Coté from then on, and that's what people have called me. I've been an industry analyst at several firms, at a little firm called Red Monk, and then at 451 Research. And before that, for about 10 years, I was a software developer at a bunch of little startups and an online banking place. And oddly relevant, I worked at B&C Software for a long time. If you've ever used any of my software, be sure to tell me so I can leave before I have to apologize to you. And also, I like to write things and publish things. So I do a few podcasts, and I on and off write a column for the Register about DevOps and Agile and whatever other thing they want me to make fun of. But I also recently came out with this little, O'Reilly calls these reports, just to infuriate the people who write them, who would rather call them books. But there's this little report that I recently wrote up about the last 3 or so years of me studying how large organizations improve how they do their software. And you can get a copy of it for free if you like. You can either give your email address to my employer at Pivotal, or if you use Gmail, you can put a little plus sign in there after your name and put something like delete, and then you never have to see that email again. And also, I've got a couple of other books. There's one that's a collection of my columns over the years about DevOps and things like that. And way back when, in the middle of, what do you call the aughts? And back in 2005, I wrote this book about the Java authentication and authorization service, if you really want to put yourself to sleep. And if you've ever written like a technical book, I think the results of writing a technical book is you realize how much you despise the subject matter you're writing about. Which certainly happened there. So anyways, there's my Twitter nonsense if you're interested in that. But before we get to the platform part, let's talk about taxes, which for me, being an American citizen, is a highly relevant thing this time of year, or a month or so ago. But I think more generally to the sort of narrative here, I like to sort of start with the end goal, the point of going through all this suffering, right? Like if you're going to figure out some intricate directory structure of like YAML files and what a circuit breaker is and how to do Ansible and things like that, it's good to know like what's at the end of that tunnel, like what's driving you to go do it. And as I sort of mentioned on the cover slide there, a lot of what I am interested in is how that sort of layer between software and actual end users doing something, or people, if you want to call them that, and how that kind of interaction like helps an organization run better, whether it's a for-profit business or a non-profit business, like the IRS here, the U.S. tax collectors, as my grandfather used to call them, the Infernal Revenue Service. But this is a very simple story that I think gets to what the end goal, to me, of all of this kind of stuff is, as far as improving how an organization does software, and therefore improving how the organization does its business. And this case is a little questionable, but improving a person's sort of productivity with that software. So this is a case, and what as I go over, think about two different scenarios. One, if you could, on a weekly basis or so, get feedback about if your software was functioning properly and if you had implemented the features well. And then on a more traditional cycle of, let's say, 1 year or 2 years, or in the case of several military organizations, 10 to 12 years. And that's more of a release cycle that you have your software on, right? So these are the kind of like parallel life cycles that software go through in their full release. So oftentimes, and this probably never happens around here, at least for the people in this room, people back in the States are delinquent paying their taxes, which is to say they paid them late. And there's a good notification system the IRS has where every single day you owe more taxes. It's like the worst loan you've ever had. And so, in theory, unless you're some sort of political protester or living in a cabin out in the woods or something and trying to make some statement, you want to pay off your taxes as fast as possible. On what today you want to pay them off because you're just going to owe more tomorrow. And so typically, and this is very representative of a lot of the software projects I see at large organizations, the way that you would find out how many taxes you owed and paid them up is you would use a phone, if you remember those. And you would dial a number and call them up, and I'm sure there was someone there with a green screen application like typing on it, and they would find some field and whatever. And I don't know about you, but using phones is terrible. It's nothing that I ever look forward to. And it's also very expensive because humans are expensive and they have to man it, and those green screen applications, well, they're actually probably very cheap nowadays. But the overall experience was not only costly, as it were, but also the sort of, I guess you could call it, the availability of the service was equally terrible, because we don't really like to fund people who take money from us back in the US. So the IRS gets less and less budget each budgeting cycle. So it's not like they have a lot of money to make sure there's enough phones or people to answer these phones. So consequently, let's see if I can do the math correctly, 63% of the time you would just never reach anyone. So you would dial it up and maybe you would be on hold forever, or maybe they would do, I think what they called it was a courtesy disconnect, which was another great user story, which was like, user would not like to have to talk to the IRS today. So they would satisfy that by hanging up on you. Which is great. Someone took that requirement very literally. There must have been some outsourcers. And so what that means, right, you have terrible availability, terrible customer service, it costs a lot of money, it's overall just a bad project, a bad sort of service. So the IRS wanted to put some software in place, much better way of doing it by a phone. And their original idea, and again think about like, so if we could test out our idea for how to implement a feature, and change it weekly or monthly very rapidly. Contrast that with if we would have gone through this process on, let's be very charitable and say a year release cycle, right, every 12 months, probably much more for the IRS, but whatever. So their idea of how we solved that problem was originally an idea that I've noticed developer teams having over the eons of development, as it were, is essentially, they're accountants, right? And just like sysops and sysadmins, they're sort of like, look at all this data we have, lots of logs. Like, I could spend all day just jumping around in these logs like a big ball pit. And so you sort of want to share your joy of logs and data. I mean, they're accountants, very similar. And so their idea was like, well, when you log into the IRS, you want it to be sort of like, your Facebook moments or your iPhotos things or whatever you may be using. And you're going to log in and relive your memories with the IRS, right? So over here, you're going to see like kind of like your complete financial history, all the accounting that was happening, all the joyous times you got to interact with the tax collector. So what they found out is once they put this in front of end users, again on a very short cycle, and it's highlighted in orange because it's late in the day, you might have had some beer, so you don't want to actually figure out the real answer. But they found that when people were looking for how much taxes they owed, they were still confused enough that they didn't exactly know how much they owed, and so they wanted to, maybe not immediately, but they wanted to very quickly pick up the phone and call someone, right? So think about what that means from like the perspective of like, I would like to be successful in what I do. But more importantly, like the success of this organization is, it would be like a total failure, right? And funding that project would take a long time. There would be a lot of not only money but time put into it. And I guarantee you that like every time the IRS fails, there's like very hungry lions just waiting to pounce and rip it apart, right? Like, sure, no one works in an organization like that, but essentially it would have been a huge sort of failure. But because they had figured out a process to make failures actually valuable, I forget who was asking or commenting about a learning organization, but they were trying to learn from this. Yeah, every sort of, I forget the interval, every week or two, they would put this in front of an actual end user, and then they would come up with a new theory of how to solve that problem. And eventually what they discovered, and it sounds really ridiculous when you think about it, but if you're like me and you file expenses frequently, you encounter this problem all the time. The problem being like the people who wrote this software never actually used it. But what they found out is that when you want to know how much money you owe the IRS, all you want to know is how much money you owe the IRS. You don't want to relive your memories with them or anything, right? And so they put that in place, and this is kind of dated, but that's been in place for several years now. And one, their availability went way up, as you can imagine, from being courtesy disconnected. And as they've evolved it further and further, I think nowadays they've probably cleared at least $500 million or so through this instead of doing it in a phone way. So that is, again, it's a very simple example, but it's like it's the general kind of thing that I focus on more is like you've got a very real, for them, valuable problem that you're trying to solve. And you want to make sure that all this effort you're putting into software actually solves the problem in a good way, instead of just being like another piece of junky software that we have to suffer through and use. So how that disciplined approach that people get to, and then I'll go a little bit down the stack from developers about how platforms support that. But I think it's valuable to think about this being the more abstract end goal we're shooting to, right? Like long ago, back for that software I probably need to apologize for. Although sadly not that long ago, some people still do this a lot. There was more of this idea of service delivery, right? Which was, we're going to specify what this service should do and the software and how it should function, what kind of capacity we need. It's sort of like, the old civil engineering metaphors we like to use in software, right? Like we're going to build this highway, it needs this much gravel. It's great how we use those metaphors. I have no idea what I'm talking about with civil engineering. I assume they just plan things out or whatever, but as far as I know, they actually, I've had my houses back in the States renovated many times. I'm pretty sure the contractors file an advanced agile methodology because they're always making new things up and getting over budget and schedule. So anyways, I should stop using those metaphors. But in IT, what that meant is that you would basically do what some people call a waterfall process, but you would have this very disciplined process of specifying requirements out, implementing it, giving it over to someone to run, and then you would run through this cycle again. And like all cycles, it looks cool, and then you get people involved, and it bogs down. So we'll see how long this new cycle can operate. But just to make it explicit with the example I was giving you, right? This is the general cycle that you go through to make your software essentially well designed as far as how a user is expecting the features to be implemented, and kind of getting to that point with the IRS where you realize you just showed them that one amount. And that is, if you've ever done software, which I think a few people in this room have, basically you never really know exactly what you're doing. Like you might know how to type, but you're never really too sure what problem you're solving exactly, let alone how you should best solve it. And what you do is you very iteratively work through discovering that problem and exploring it, trying new things out, kind of throwing it at the wall, as they used to say, and seeing what sticks, which is another strange metaphor now that I think of it. But you go through that cycle and you're constantly learning and figuring things out, right? And I always like to think of the word learn as the positive version of the word fail. Like I've got a 5 and a 9-year-old, and I was realizing what they do in school all day, and it makes me really respect their psychological grounding, because I would be devastated by it. But they basically just fail all day long, right? Like just constant failure. And somehow my son gets a little bit better at handwriting. My daughter still doesn't know what an L is, but eventually she will, if she fails enough. But you go through the cycle and you use a failure, like with the IRS, to realize like, oh, this doesn't work, right? And if you have this cycle on a fast enough loop, on a weekly loop or even less, you actually get a tremendous amount of learning, that is failure. And you actually can improve the way you do your software operates very quickly. And I mean, you know, obviously, if you realize that this is basically the scientific method, which you hopefully may recall. If you can, you should go over to Skiffle and fly back to my country and re-educate people about it, because we could certainly use the help. Usually people love that joke, but that's fine. So the development teams that are on top of that, just to briefly go over it, and it was mentioned a little bit in the previous talk, but the way you achieve that, if you think about that fast weekly loop, like essentially you're not going to have a lot of time to go to your change advisory board committee every week to sort of approve the changes that you have. And you won't have a lot of time to manually configure what production looks like. And in general, you also need to have a very fast, a very close loop on the other end of that, which is, you could call them business owners or whatever you want to call them, the people who know what the product should be doing. They generally also don't have time to sort of like email and coordinate with the team. So you tend to have these more unified teams of people who, usually we still call them developers, but you have developers and the designers and product managers, and they tend to, one, there's usually no dark wood in their office. So if you have dark wood in your office and you want to improve how you're doing software, immediately get some light colored wood, because you're not going to succeed with dark wood. And you need lots of light as well. So Vampire is very bad at software. But essentially you have these unified teams who work together very closely, and they really do follow this notion of, as was previously discussed more or less, is they have responsibility for that product, right? And I keep saying the word product instead of project, but they have full end-to-end as far as the life responsibility of what's in that product, how it's implemented, the quality of it, running it in production, and to use another word, they have autonomy around it, right? So there's very few people telling them what to do, to put it in simple terms. And so these teams, I generally think of them as product teams, but I'll probably, after this, refer to them as developers, because that's a lot easier to say. But these teams are the ones that are running on top of a platform, if you will, right? So they're spending their time paying attention to those users and going through that loop and enjoying their gigantic open spaces and very clean desks. So how do these teams get to the point where they're autonomous and they can operate on their own, that they have enough time on a weekly cycle to actually come up with a new theory of how to tell people how many taxes they owe, a way to implement that, test it, deploy it to production, and then observe how it's used, right? I mean, that's a lot of work if you think about it. That's probably more work than I do in a month, come to think of it. But that's a lot of work to compress down into a week, let alone enjoying free beverages and stuff afterwards. I was told here at Zevia, every 2 weeks they have like a 5-hour internal conference, which sounds wonderful. So you're going to have to compress your other work, your every other work week, 4 days that you do a cycle on. So how do you, let's use 4 days, because really who works 5 days? Let's say you've got 4 days to like do a complete rev of your software, right? And what becomes important and what we'll go over is that it turns out there's really no time to like program like YAML and worry about how containers are built or do any of that stuff in that week cycle. And so we've been, trying to solve this problem for, 2019? Well over 20 years now, right? Like, no one really likes configuring servers. I mean, I suppose when I was younger on Friday nights, instead of like going out and dating, I like, changing the wallpaper on my Windows desktop. So maybe some people do like configuring servers, if you remember all those INI files. I saw that Microsoft came out with this like, what do you call these things? Remember you would start up this thing and it would be an ANSI and there would be a file list over here and then a little window pane over here and a command prompt. I saw there's a new thing from Microsoft. I used to know this guy who was a programmer and he had one of those and it was amazing. He obviously did not date a lot in high school. He was very skilled at it. So anyways, over the past, let's say 20 or so years, we've been trying to solve this problem of how do we get our developers to focus on actually developing code, right? Or how do we automate servers and do automation. And I didn't really plan this, but here's another BMC reference. But one day, long after I'd been at BMC, I came across this poster, which I mostly put here because it's awesome, right? This is like the most awesome enterprise software poster I think you would probably ever see. It's sort of like this actualization of like automating server configuration in some, anyways, I could go on about it. I used to have a whole podcast where I would in-depth analyze the sort of rhetoric of enterprise software marketing, which we can talk about later. So, you know, this is one of the two companies along with Opsware, which I think it's interesting if you've ever read or been referred to that book, The Hard Thing About Hard Things. Those are like lessons of running a infrastructure automation company. One of the companies that HP eventually bought, there was another one, Opsware, and then you had Blade Logic. And these companies were basically picking up the annoying manual configuration, I was going to say garbage, but sort of just like destruction that basically Windows brought in the late 90s, right? Like if you ever had to go around and like update Windows manually, it's not cool. So a lot of this software was around like how do we automate that and automate it not only on the desktop side but the server side. And you know, it was great. It was better than like Ghost or whatever that nonsense was, and definitely better than NetWare and other things like that. But eventually it started to become its own sort of problem and slow things down, and it wasn't fast enough for getting anywhere near close those weekly release cycles that people were longing for. And then sometime about 10 years or so ago, depending on how you want to date it, like all charts, not like all charts, but like all charts, you should be asking, could I see the raw data that generated this? Don't ever ask that question of charts in PowerPoints. But this chart, you know, I don't know if it's really based on anything real or just like one organization that Chef worked for back in 2007. But it is highly representative of the huge change that came with automation around, let's say the late 2007, 2010, right? And this is really sort of like, I think historically, the first visualization of anything related to DevOps that might have come about. And I know you can't click on it now, but maybe when you're back home and you're done changing your INI files and you want something else to do, you can go read up on this. But essentially, this shows you that the traditional way of doing operations, right? It makes something obvious that we all sort of know now, so I'm going to proceed to talk about it anyways. But it shows how much effort you had to put into doing operations, whether it was running things, configuring them, setting them up, verifying them. There's a tremendous amount of work that went into it. And as DevOps and the tools around it, particularly Chef and Puppet, and later on, things like Ansible and whatever Assault is, came around. You can see that a lot of that, to use a more modern term, a lot of that toil and that time was sucked out of the full life cycle of the product. And I was an analyst back when all of this was coming up, and all of this stuff was very real, that you would get insane sort of improvements to how the operations, how the front end of configuring servers and the ongoing maintenance was done by actually using brand new tools. And that's sort of like the start of a new type of platform, right? And it's kind of interesting to think about like someone was asking about Ansible earlier, right? Like it's interesting to think about how you have these tools like Chef and Puppet and Ansible, and like, do they like create platforms, or are they platforms, or how are they related? Because they're not really like a runtime environment. But maybe I should think about that more before talking about it. So eventually this sort of like rolled on and evolved and into, this is an excerpt from one of the more recent DevOps reports, right? And this idea of speeding up how we do our configuration to the point of improving the way that we do our software, to the point of improving the way our organization works. It evolved into this highly exciting set of thought technologies and other technologies called DevOps, right? And I was trying to look back to see how many DevOps reports there were. I think they go all the way back to 2009, maybe. So they're getting pretty mature as far as like their venerability, which is good. But eventually we kind of settled on this as like, if you want to improve the way operations is done, so your developers can focus more on improving the way they do their software, we've got this wonderful flow chart of things, right? And there are a set of technological processes, many of which were mentioned previously, that you do, like, with the most, not nowadays, but back then crazy sounding things like, maybe you should check all of your stuff into version control, including all of your configuration changes in production. Which is to say, more abstractly, maybe you should think about production as part of your software and part of what you have responsibility for, and treat it like any other part of your software that you have. And then there was a lot of other things that kind of go under the name of like culture, or you could think of them as norms or practices about, you should be nice to people and I don't know, be a good manager and not let people burn themselves out, and generally just be human, which I think oddly enough is always something every 5 or so years that needs to be injected back into our world of engineers. So good for them. But there was this very, I think well-proven out study. I mean, the people who did it have like a PhD, so it must be right. I have a bachelor's degree in philosophy, which means I don't understand any of that. But anyways, it has settled down as something extremely beneficial. And then what you've seen is this kind of like reign of niceness, almost peace when it comes to the ability of organizations to deploy their software. And so what you can see is it used to take many years to get software out the door. And now the industry average is about, I don't know, just a rough estimate is about every quarter people can release a software. So every 3 or 4 months, or maybe 2 months, or maybe 8 months, whatever. Averages are fickle, weird things. But about quarterly is fine. And so that's a huge improvement from back when I did software, and which is great for my twice a month paychecks and working at Pivotal. There's a lot of large organizations that still aren't that great and need quite a bit of help. So things have generally improved, but the problem is another reading of this chart, and this is I think this chart in this room is big enough that this chart is just to be at another meta level. Like I was saying, I like to do like rhetoric of marketing stuff, but like this chart is a fantastic example how to effectively use a chart in a presentation, which is to say, I bet it's really hard to read all the text on this chart. All you can see are these lines, which means I can tell you exactly and only what I want you to think about the chart, which I'm about to do right now. Which is, if you look down here, these lines show you they show you exactly 5 years of survey data, right? So if you look at this as 5 years of survey data, and you notice that the line is essentially the same, things get a little dimmer, right? So for the past 5 years, we haven't really improved with our release cycles, right? Like we've been stuck at a quarterly basis, which actually, at my age and point in my career, sounds great, not to have to improve and try anymore. I can just stick where I am, as I'll demonstrate the rest of my presentation. But it is something I think that we as an industry need to shoot for more. And by industry, I mean people who do and run software, custom-made software. Because in general, I'll kind of take this for granted, but the faster you can get software out the door, you get that better design quality that I was talking about, like with the IRS. But there's also better, I don't know what to call it, performance, production quality. If you can get your software out every week, then at least every week you can deploy bug fixes, right? And at least every week you can try to fix something, if not daily or multiple times a week. So just getting your software out more frequently generally improves the quality of your software and improves your overall effort of doing things. So therefore, what we should be wanting to do is move that curve, closer and closer to multiple times a day if possible. So we'll see what happens in year 6, 7, and whatnot. But that's really a huge goal of what I see people doing with platforms, as again, is a good example previously, and what it is, how they're trying to solve this problem of speeding up the release cycles. Now, the reason this happens, I think, or this is just one thing, I finally got around to reading this paper on serverless stuff from Berkeley from, February of this year or so. Or not from all of Berkeley, from the CS department in Berkeley. That would be fun to read a paper by all of them. But I think it represents a lot of what people encounter, where really, if you're thinking of that 4 to 5 day cycle, you're not going to write that much code, right? You're going to have a couple of features that you put in place, and you'll probably be done with that, after 2 days. And then you're just now I need to do a bunch of YAML stuff and build my containers and do this and set up this thing over here. And I got to figure out what an Istio is. And now I need to pull all this stuff together. And what you very rapidly find nowadays is that you spend a lot of your time on operational things rather than just on but writing your applications, right? So we're much better than multiple times a year, right, at quarterly, but we still are in the middle of this trap of not spending as much time as we would like on development. Now, that kind of approach would be sort of fine if you had one application, or even something as complicated. So this is from Comcast, a big internet telco company. I guess they own NBC now, which is strange. they're a customer of Pivotal, so they're a fantastic company. I'm not disparaging them at all. But this is like basically the diagram of their system for, I think, all of their cable business, right? From taking in customers, dealing with customers, delivering it, rolling out trucks, and you can see the sort of impressiveness of it with these impressive figures on the side. But it might be okay if you have to like spend a lot of time configuring and worrying about your operation stuff in addition to all the applications on top of it. And this is, of course, multiple development teams working on all of this. But again, I like to study large organizations, and the problem they have is that they have tens, if not hundreds, of these systems, right, that they're dealing with, especially as whether you're in retail or banking or insurance or not usually government, but all of the typical like large types of industries, they consolidate more and more, and you get more and more of these systems, right? So thinking about like all, as each of these different boxes writes a few lines of JavaScript, and they need to do all that configuration under it, it starts to multiply out quite a bit and be something of a nuisance. Even if each of the runtime environments, the platforms that each of these boxes have, is like super awesome, right, and great. Which, like I said, I don't know math, but I think statistically that would be impossible. But all of them are still duplicating a lot of this effort, and as problems come up, they all have their exciting, unique problems to address, right? So what I see in large organizations more and more, and again to reference it, like what we were just seeing a bit of, is it's almost, and it's very counterintuitive to when I was brought up as a developer, as I'll get into, but is this idea of standardizing on a platform, on a centralized platform, right? So we're going to have one platform to support as much of that stuff as possible. It's not always possible to support all of it, obviously. There's still like, I don't know, some batch jobs running somewhere that you haven't converted over, but you're going to standardize as much of that as possible and make sure that as many people as possible are running on it. And as another example, there's a Canadian bank called Scotia, and they own like they've acquired a bunch of banks in South America, and I think maybe one or two over here and elsewhere. And as you can imagine, every one of those banks has their own complete backend system. And I used to work in M&A when I was at Dell, and one of the key things you do in an acquisition is you say, we're going to remove all the duplicative IT, and that's how we're going to make money. So a lot of what they have to do is remove that duplicated IT to get, and here, synergies, which that's the only correct use of synergies you'll probably hear this week. But you get these synergies of these two companies coming together, and it makes your business case and everything is happy and hunky-dory in M&A. And the fact that I don't work in M&A anymore shows you how good I was at synergies. But this idea of centralizing on a platform definitely comes up over and over again with the large organizations I can study. So what is this platform, right? And more importantly, I think the notion of as a product, as I'll get into, that's the huge difference from what it used to be. But mostly what I'm talking about, and maybe it's funner to say we like I'm some monarch, but what we're talking about with the platform is the people who are using this platform will be developers, those product teams I was mentioning. So like, let's think about how we would make their life better. Those developers are our customers. And what are their expectations nowadays of what they want to do? And this is like a weirdly done sort of representation of a tweet from one of my friends, Matt Curry. He used to work at Allstate, now he works at some big bank somewhere. I haven't actually checked his LinkedIn in a while, so I don't know if he still works there. But obviously developers would like to spend their time doing code. They don't want to do boring things. Basically, I don't know if this is still the case, but I remember when I was a developer, if I had never done something, it was the most exciting thing ever. And then once I did it, it was terribly boring. Like, so it's really fun to do things the first time, but then second and third times is terrible. But what your developers want to do is more focus on, like, I implement features that humans probably use, and I don't know, I would derive some joy if they do it well, and I can focus on delivering those features. And as one of my friends who's an enterprise architect up at UK Parliament, sadly for him, was saying, like, I want to move pixels around the screen. Like, if I'm not moving those pixels around, like, I'm not really doing anything as far as anyone can tell, which not really great for operations people to hear. Anyways, so that's sort of the basis of what you want a platform to deliver on. The feature that you're targeting is like, what do the developers need? What makes their life as easy as possible so they spend more of their time developing features? Now, underneath all of that, speaking of not moving pixels on the screen, there's a white paper down there, again, that you can't click on, but it kind of looks into what are all the functions that a platform gives you. And these are all generally agnostic of the actual products or services or projects or technology used to do it. But these are more the general requirements that you have that a platform needs to accomplish, right? Like, obviously you're going to, well, maybe not obviously, but it's highly likely you're going to be packaging your software up in containers, right? And the containers have to be orchestrated, and they have to be, the networking has to be configured between them. And then, you're going to need some storage, unless you're doing like a mortgage loan application thing. I don't know, but you're probably going to need some storage if you're getting paid enough in your job. And you're going to need all these various things, and all sorts of infrastructure configured for you, right? And then you actually have to run it in production, make sure that it goes well, monitor and check out the logs, and on and on and on, right? You also need all your as we used to call it, middleware, all your services like database, load balancers, things like that, and all your application lifecycle management or ALM stuff or whatever the kids call it. And then, there's always security. I always think security is a funny thing to say you need. It's sort of like saying a car needs 4 wheels. I guess you could have a car with 3 wheels. It's like saying, a vehicle needs wheels. Like, it would be weird to have a piece of software that wasn't like secure, or at least didn't purport to be. But the point of that is that it's yet another column of hassle for people to deal with. So looking at this, right, like all of these things are most all of the features that a platform needs to provide, right? And these are the kind of things that, if you remember back to those developers, if they had to worry about it, would be a lot more than 4 days worth of work that they had to configure and come in and do things with. And if you're thinking like, hey, Coté, that looks like everything in IT, your analysis is correct, right? Like running your own custom-written software requires you to basically do everything. Otherwise, you would just go buy like SAP and get what you get with that instead of writing your own stuff. But so think about, like, as you're like considering your platform strategy and putting that in place, this is kind of like the dartboard of awesomeness you need to achieve. So in putting together that strategy, right? So we're gonna build a platform for all these groups out here, all these bank branches we're gonna consolidate, or whatever the case may be, right? One of the first steps that a platform team, the organization building the platform, needs to walk through is like, so what's, like, for lack of a better phrase, what's the layer of abstraction we want to deliver to, right? Like, where do we, the platform, end, and then the developers begin? And this is just one of many, but I guess sort of geographically relevant analysis that Rabo made. And there's a great overview of this that you can look up as well. But essentially, their analysis was like, so thinking in terms of a platform, there's kind of like 4 things. This chart's always hard for me because being an analyst, I'm used to like good being up here and middlingly good being over there. But this is good over here, so you can reorient yourself. But their analysis was like, you could have developers, the layer of abstraction is VMs, right? So developers are responsible for filling VMs and connecting them together, and that's cool. Or you can have what all developers want is containers, right? So developers are responsible for specifying containers, maybe not specifying them, it depends, but they're responsible for filling them, updating them, and wiring them together. And then they put all their application stuff. Or, and this is the logo of the open source project, Cloud Foundry, or they have more of a platform as a service approach, where developers are essentially responsible for their applications, and they like kind of declaratively say, like, these are the parts and I need a database, and just kind of like stick them in a smoothie and put it on a Frappe for 2 minutes. And you more rely on the platform, kind of in like a Heroku style, if you're familiar with that, or the kind of platforms as a service, to take all of your code and figure out how to run it for you instead of you packaging it up. Or like the even more ideal sort of like nirvana of things is like, we're just going to do functions or serverless programming or whatever. And all you really need to do is like, when like the customer's train of thought enters your little like 50-line chunk of code, you just do the one thing and then pass it along to the next sucker to deal with in the stream of processing. And each of these, like as it goes up, right, like there's more and more speed and more sort of like closer to the actual like developer sort of thing that you get to. But the choice, what's more important than sort of like each individual one, is choosing which one you want your platform to deliver on, right? And their decision, right, was like, there are some instances, there's very, very few instances where we want our developers touching VMs. Like generally that's a bad idea. There's some instances where they should be doing container things, which is fine. But for the most part, we want them to just focus on more of that pure platform as a service approach, where they don't have to build their own infrastructure out, even at the container level. And as you can tell by the precision of their analysis, right, so in about 84.962% of the time, that solution was correct. As you can tell, that's a completely made up number. I mean, it is well over half or whatever, but it's definitely, I mean, it might be 84.9. I don't know about 62. That's a little ridiculous. But that's the first step in figuring out what you want to do with your platform that you need to go through is like, what do we want our developers doing? What layer of abstraction do we want them operating at? Now, the next problem you're going to get is you know, hilariously represented by this. I think this is the only animated GIF I have, so sorry if you're expecting more. But essentially, you know, if you're a developer and I were to tell you, hey, how about instead of you determining your own sort of platform that you run on, I just give you one and you're forced to use it. Generally, you're going to think that sounds terrible, right? And the reason is because over the course of time, what's not all time, but over the course of the past 30 years, what tends to happen is you have a centralized platform, right? And it's really awesome for the first year. And then you're like, hey, could you update the version of Java in it? And they say, first of all, you need to file a ticket. Second of all, maybe in 3 years, because we got a lot of stuff going on, right? And you say like, hey, I want to do like event programming, so can you put like Kafka in there? And there's not, the only answer to that is like no, right? So you have this centralized platform, and it really never evolves at a pace that you want to. So as a developer, what you learn very rapidly is basically like, I should never use a centralized platform, right? I need to build my own thing from the metal, because then I can evolve it at the pace that I want. And then also, like I remember back when I was in my 20s, I think me and all my friends built platforms at least 3 times. Like, if you're in your 20s and you're looking for some career advice, before you get a job, build a platform. Just get it out of your system, because eventually you're going to build a platform that does everything, and you should just do that, and then you can enter the workforce instead of repeating it over and over again. I mean, really, like the first few weeks you get to a job, you learn the system, and then probably, I guarantee if you're a developer, your first thought is like, I bet I could write just some code to improve this whole thing. We should just make a new framework. Anyways, so the problem is like your developers don't trust that the platform's going to evolve fast enough. So that's where the product part of this comes in, right? And you know, just to summarize it again, right? The notion needs to be of the team running the platform. How do we make our developers' life better? How do we treat them as the customer? How do we product manage this platform, right? Instead of delivering a service and meeting all these SLAs and numbers, we're going to, just as we expect our developers to constantly evolve their software, we're going to take that same mentality and come up with a stack and a set of processes that allows us to constantly develop and update that software, paying attention to what our actual customers want. Now, that may seem like an impossible task if you're in operations, because you're trying to figure out how to get a Kafka instance up and running, right? Like you've got all this time you're spending like running stuff, troubleshooting it, probably like going to meetings to get your new ITIL certification from elephants and things like that. But you're spending a lot of time that just doing like exciting, thrilling stuff that, you know, in SRE world they would characterize as toil, right? And maybe someone remembers better than I do. I forget the somewhat rule of thumby technical definition. I guess that would be like a robot thumb definition of toil. But it's essentially something that you find yourself doing over and over again. Maybe like multiple times a day or 5 times a week. There's some fun little definition. But it's something that could obviously be automated, that has little to no value to whoever your end user is, your customer, right? And one of the first things and continuously that these platform teams, operations people running a platform do, is they very ruthlessly always are searching out for toil, for things they can automate. And over time what that does is that frees up their time to focus on more interesting things and to product manage it, right? So, you know, I mean, there's a few astounding figures here about the efficiency with some platforms that operations people get, right? You need just a handful of operations people with a proper platform strategy in place to support a huge amount of developers, right? And that's because there's so much automation and toil reduction. And just as one quick example, right, this is from Daimler, which I think I'm pronouncing that right. I had to sit down with like a German for a couple of hours to stop saying Daimler and say Daimler. So there you go. Anyways, you can imagine how I'm progressing with Dutch. So what they did, the operations team was looking at what does it take to get one line of code through, theoretically, right? And it would take about 30 days or so to figure out getting that code through, which is pretty good if you remember our chart. But they wanted to reduce that down as much as possible. So among many other things, they found this one chunk, the hardware provisioning and hosting configuration, right? So they got their software, they need to set up the infrastructure, and that would take, I can't really do visual math here, but let's say a third of the time, about a week or so, it would take to just like get the servers and get them set up to use. Now, I haven't bought a car in a while, and I probably wouldn't buy a Mercedes. I don't know why, it seems like a lot of money. But I'm sure people don't walk into the Mercedes dealership and say, you know what I like about this fine German engineering is the care and time you put into provisioning the server. It's really why I come here. And so from that perspective, right, like configuring a server has like very little value. And so it's an obvious thing to look at, but thinking about how can we reduce that down as much as possible is a good example of like toil remover. And along with all sorts of other things, they got their release cycle down to just a couple of days instead of it taking quite a long time. So that's really how you free up your time and enable yourself to more focus on doing things in a product way, is really make sure you almost over-rotate on automation. So once you're kind of in that path, this is kind of how these teams tend to organize themselves, right? So illustrated by cats, thanks to one of my coworkers down there. Cats. So you got your developer teams up here, right? And they've got their platform as represented by this with all the exciting stuff that it does. And then down here is this platform team, right? And there's a couple of key roles that are on this platform team. So first of all, you have your platform engineers, those people who know how to change their desktop wallpaper really well. And they spend, as you can imagine, they're not really always like developers so much, but they do have that developer mindset of how do I reduce toil, how do I automate things, how do I sort of analyze a problem from the perspective of how do I program it away, right? Rather than thinking about how I deliver on a service or do more typical sysoppy kind of things. So you obviously have a lot of these platform engineers on the team doing things, and they're also responsible for upgrading and doing all the exciting stuff that your gigantic platform needs, right? Like it's a fun thought experiment to go through, like so like when they need to deploy a patch on Amazon, like how do they do that, right? Like eventually you've got to like upgrade the cloud, as it were. So they have responsibility over all of that. And then, as you can imagine, if you're trying to treat it as a product, right, you've got this feedback loop with developers, trying out features that they want, seeing if it works for them, listening to them. You also have a product manager for the platform team, which is probably a role that has never existed in the ops side. There's always project managers and other things like that, but someone who's really thinking about delivering it as a product rarely comes up. And then finally, the other role that is incredibly important, as we'll get into a little bit, is in large organizations in particular, is you can think of them as a platform champion or an executive or whatever, but they're the role that actually comes in and says, all right, if we're going to do this for 10,000 employees, we can't just guarantee that this small team is going to be a really rapid fungus that grows up and changes the rest of the organization. We actually need to have high-level support and go through all of those exciting, boring meetings with slides and all the kind of corporate jockeying that we need to do to make this happen at scale. So those are the basic, very high-level roles that you see on a platform team. And again, the idea is treating it more and more of a product rather than sort of this service that we're delivering. So here's a quick summary that I'm going to show you and then skip over, kind of like the rotating cake things or pie things. But there are, and obviously I can give you the slides if you want. If you go look on my Twitter account, I just posted them earlier today. But you can kind of see a quick summary of what the platform team does, what their goals are. And again, it's just but it's a reorientation of what operations does and how they're supporting development. Now, just as a side note, I've been trying to figure out, if you remember, I kind of left this part off, but back when I was studying DevOps, as it was evolving, if you kind of take this view, there's doesn't seem to be a whole lot of ops left in dev, which I don't think is incredibly accurate, but it is an interesting rethinking of we tried to bring out this silo of operations, and now I guess I just suggested yes, we should have one gigantic silo instead of a whole bunch of little ones. I don't really know what to do with that. Now, despite that little mind quagmire, if you're interested, if you like reading Gartner stuff, I think you can get this for free if you follow that down there. But there is you're starting to see in survey results that people actually are improving not only improving, but being able to scale up the way that they do DevOps. And by DevOps, and what they mean here is those autonomous product teams that own the entire product end to end and therefore can release their software more frequently. But what I really like, having been a customer myself on a few occasions, is having it be something that actually makes the software better, that raises the customer satisfaction for it, right? So again, I talk with organizations all the time, and usually things bog down with like, I got to file the ticket because they have some like gigantic outsourcing agreement with someone. But like, it really is worth your organization's time to figure out how to stop having to file tickets. Like, it has a very meaningful effect. So finally, I'll just spend a few minutes going over some tactics of how people have rolled this out. Because I always enjoy hearing what awesomeness sounds like, what the end state looks like. And my issue is always like, yes, but how do I get there, right? Like, if I'm at the bottom of this well and I've just run out of water and I don't have rope or a ladder, like, how am I gonna get up there to enjoy it? So that's more of what I tend to study and pay attention to. And so I'll give you a little bit of examples of how organizations are actually achieving and going to that platform as a product state. So first of all, just to emphasize it, I don't think there's really any medium or large size organization. And what I mean by that is, I don't know, a medium organization is anywhere from 1,000 to 5,000 to 999,000 employees. It all is fuzzy and depends. But definitely a large organization has, way more people than that, right? And multiple applications and multiple departments and things that they're working on. But I haven't really encountered any organization where there wasn't a pretty high-level team of executives supporting this changeover, right? Which may sound obvious, but I more mentioned it one, so that if you are in some sort of managerial position, you realize like how important it is that you get involved in that. You can't just sort of like, bring in a box of like the DevOps handbook and sort of like throw it out at people and then expect anything to happen. You've got to like actually do some work. But also equally, if you're not in a managerial position and you notice that like this is the time, not this time, but you're thinking like, we were just told we're going to be doing DevOps and SRE and improving things, and then you look around and there's like no executives doing anything, my number one tip to you is do nothing different. Because next year they're going to come in and say like, why did nothing improve? And they'll get very upset. And the reason nothing improved is because they weren't involved, right? So just save yourself a lot of hassle. Just keep your head low and wait till next year. So unless you have executives involved, nothing really effective is going to change at scale. So to that point, one of the tools that is used to change organizations over is, I think of it as basically starting small, right? Which maybe is slightly counterintuitive, right? But if you think of a large organization, the best way that I've seen to change all of it is to start as small as possible. To start with maybe one application that you're working on, and to move that application over, and then maybe start with another one and a third one. Now, that sounds obvious now that I'm listening to myself, but I have encountered many organizations which are like, this sounds awesome, so what we should do is by this time, 2 years from now, we will change over the entire .com site that makes us billions of dollars. That's our great idea of how to improve, right? So you definitely don't want to choose the largest, riskiest thing to switch over. Because again, going back to the joyous times my kids have at school, pretty much what you're going to be doing the first year is failing constantly, right? Like, you'll have a new approach to software, you'll be using new technology, you're going to be screwing up a lot, to use a more technical term. And you've got to somehow use that failure to learn how to do things much better. Now, on the other hand, what you do want to do is you need to pick a couple of actual applications that are like actually business facing or used by people, right? So you don't want to like do a conference room scheduler and then go present to people and be like, look how awesome this was. Now we can schedule a conference room with your initial projects. What you want to do is actually pick an important, or as we would say back in the M&A world, material application, but that is kind of has a low risk profile. And usually what that means is that it's an application that is already in terrible states and no one has any faith in and they think it's bad. So for example, another one of our customers, Home Depot, giant hardware store, hammer seller back in the States, and they try to be elsewhere, but I'm sure they do great. They're another Pivotal customer. So one of the initial projects, there's 2 initial projects they picked that are representative of picking these initial small projects. One was, if you're like my wife and I back when we were living in Austin, in Texas, you're like, I know, it's August. I don't even know what centigrade that is, but it's about 105 degrees Fahrenheit outside. Here's what we should do. We should paint the outside of the house. And so, the way you do this in Texas is you buy several cases of Bud Light. And you go to the Home Depot and you say, like, I want my house this obscure color of blue, and they match the paint, and they give you a bunch of paint. And because you've been drinking cases of beer all week, like, you didn't really calculate how much paint you need, so around lunchtime, after you've had some delicious tacos, you realize, oh, we're out of paint, and then you got to go to Home Depot. Now, I know you're thinking, in the States, you have to drive a lot, so you're driving drunk. That's terrible. You wouldn't want to advise that, especially on tape. But the thing is, if you're that hot outside and you're drinking beer that's thin, you just sweat it all out. So effectively, you don't have any time to get drunk, so you're driving completely sober. That's something my dad taught me. So a lot of good dad lessons. Anyways, he used to also say he would be drinking a tall boy. He's dead now, so the statute of limitations is definitely over. But he would pick me up from school and be drinking, I don't know what you'll call it here, a tall boy, a 24-ounce can of beer. And he would say, Michael, because back then I was called Michael. He'd say, Michael, if I get pulled over, you're going to be drinking this beer real quick. Good times. So they picked this application. So you go into the paint store and you want to get your paint matched again. And if the paint doesn't match again, that's not cool, because you don't want a gradient pattern house, right? You used to change those files back on Friday night. You want your house to be one solid color. So the issue was the software that they were using to run that paint desk was not good. And so one of the problems that they found when this product team went out and came up with theories and how to solve it on a weekly basis, is they realized that the people at that paint desk weren't using the software. They would use sticky notes, or they would try to memorize it, I guess. I don't know what they would do. They would just write it down here, and then they would be forced to have to, manually is the weird word, but they would have to match the paint with the machines they had instead of knowing exactly what the recipe was in the past. So there was many other problems that they were solving, but that was once they fixed that software and they fixed some other problems at the paint desk, immediately once they were done, so to speak, after that, they were able to very precisely match the paint much more consistently, which, as you can imagine, solves a huge problem for them, right? Like, if you can't match that paint, then people are not going to go to you to, buy paint to paint their house. So there's several other examples that you can think of, but you can identify these projects, right, that they're already sort of in a poor state. You start to learn how to do them, running not only on a platform, but following this new methodology. And you're able to build up a series of these projects that actually have, as they would say, a business impact. And that allows you to basically control the sort of internal marketing that you're going to have around that product, and be much more successful in convincing people in the rest of the organization that you should follow this new exciting way of doing things. So then I'm going to skip over a few other things because I've entertained myself too much talking. But another thing that comes up most all of the time, another little presentation tip. I never know how to pronounce it because I don't know Italian, but you guys, it's the Pietro principle, your 80-20 spread. Basically, anytime you hear that something is 80% and 20%, it's completely bullshit. Someone's made something up again. So never say 80-20, always say 70-30, 60-40. If you're going to make something up, at least be credible, right? So, for example, when I say all or most all, I don't know exactly what I mean, but I definitely don't mean 70%. But most of the large organizations that I talk with, they follow this pattern, right? And again, think about at large scale, this being applied. So they have this new way of developing software, they're running it all on a different platform. They have a completely different approach to IT to support custom-made software. And their first challenge is we've got this existing organization, we should transform them because we're doing digital transformation. And that transform part, well, digital's funny because I guess they were doing analog before. But the transformation part is always a little bit tricky, right? Because essentially, I generally have in my mind that most organizations are immutable, right? Once they're successful and set up, you can't change them. And eventually they rot out and are unsuccessful. So instead of trying to change that organization, what a lot of these companies do is they set up an entirely new organization. Now, it may not legally be the same, be an entity or whatever, but they often, find some pale desk in a well-lit space, and they move like that initial paint desk team over there, for example, and then they move another team over there, and they're supported on a different stack of software. So basically, they're solving the problem of how to transform the organization by not solving the problem, which is a common way to solve problems. And as you can imagine, over time, if you're successful, right, you've got all your old stuff here, and eventually it kind of levels off, and you're never going to get rid of all this old stuff, because some of it, even though it's old, like myself, might be great. But you eventually are going to be able to move over and run applications in a way that's more favorable for you without being brought back, held back by older ways of doing things. So that's a little breezy round trip through this notion of what a platform as a product is, how the sort of like type of software development and product thinking that it's intended to support, a little bit about like what the requirements are and kind of like the basic strategy you would want to follow, and then some very basic how to get started putting it in place sort of items. So there's a lot more covered on that topic and many others in this booklet that I have. I don't make any money if you buy it, so I'm not hustling it that much. I just like people to read my stuff. And also, I live about 5 minutes from here, and I have a corporate Amex card. Not tonight, but I'm always happy to go out to lunch and have my company buy you some lunch and me. Not just you. But there's this great expense category. If you put it as employee meal, you get, well, it's probably 80 euros a day. But if I have something called a business meal, there's really no limit. Which I should be responsible because I'm on tape, but business meal is great. You want a business meal. So anyways, I'm always happy to talk some more. Thanks for having me.